This is a declaration of war. Everybody is worrying about The Last of Us Part 2.
And I mean absolutely everybody.
Not just Qua Part 2, but in multifaceted ways that resonate with important theoretical disputes in philosophy, academic queer theory, and the culture war divide. Walking in the subliminal space between feminism and anti-feminism, with enough identity credentials as a trans and ultra-traumatized person that can make any standpoint theorist overdose on perspective, I'll provide imminent critique of not only feminist readings of The Last of Us 2, but extrinsic deconstruction of anti-social justice word concepts and, in the ashes, endeavor to construct a mode of analysis that is truly independent and liberating. Oh, and we'll be talking about the game too. We find ourselves in the midst of an entry that feels like it couldn't have been otherwise. Sure, I can imagine some alternative world where this release was the action-adventure buddy duo, starring Joel and Ellie as the wholesome cast many people anticipated after Part 1, but I can only see total aesthetic disillusion in that counterfactual. What Naughty Dog have instead crafted is a definitive art house entry which takes interesting creative risks, which have paid off wonderfully. There's no time like the present. The weight of words unspoken permeate and overshadow the developing manifold that eventually constitutes Part 2. We encounter an oddly paced prologue that ensures the umwelt nearly folds into itself. I say oddly as a point of praise. With the tonal context established by the first game, Ellie finds herself in a suspiciously comfortable and wholesome lifestyle within Jackson. The settlement that Joel's brother Tommy had no small hand in crafting and protecting. Joel's infamous lie that defines the ending of Part 1 and paints deep tones of black onto Part 2 is not overtly mentioned for the first hours in the game. You only feel it creeping in through moment-to-moment presentation, with every fluidly animated gesture communicating this message. The tastefully understated strain that exists between Joel and Ellie is virtually in the air, polluting the entire scenery, concrete manifestations of the past impressing itself upon time. Long before Part 2 was released, I expected the sequel to be darker, grittier, and heavily shaped by consequences born from Part 1's ending. There's a not uncommon trend in video games for the second title, one that still closely follows the formula of the original, to take creative risks and veer off into experimental directions.
With time cycles such as
The Witcher 2's non-linear storytelling compared to The Witcher 1,
Prince of Persia Warrior Within compared to
The Sands of Time, Knights of the Old Republic 2's inversion of Star Wars following the first game, Soul River 2 giving the already intricate and well-thought-out script of Soul River 1 a run for its money.
A Puerto Rican's love of tragedy.
In contrast to the first game's amicably dissolved tension, Dragon Age 2, unfinished as it was, with the developers only receiving a mere year to really assemble the game, was already
A more experimental work
that was undermined by a lack of resources.
and Metal Gear Solid 2.
But I don't have anything to say about that yet. It is possible to intuit the shape of a sequel not only by the emotional motifs available in the previous entry, but through what writers are coming and going, what clues have been provided in interviews and classically misleading trailers. A few fan theories constructed 4 years before the game's release were able to expertly and non-accidentally predict the fate of Joel from cinematographic and musical scoring details. Deep tones of black were shading this game pre-release. I could feel the blow landing long before it arrived. In bare structural form, it is the story I expected, but certainly not one I could have predicted in precise detail. Ellie finds herself living the phantom variety of a full life in Jackson. Here we have a community that, to any degree possible in a post-apocalypse, provides a reasonable amount of stability, access to the materials she needs to thrive. Yet, you can feel in every breath she breathes, in every word she speaks, that she is simply not there. Her strained relationship with Joel, and the destination that brought it about, filters out all of her positive experiences. This is where our aggressively normal characters, Jesse and Dina, serve as a tasteful tonal contrast. Dina is full of fire and life. Jesse is full of wit and an overbearing kind of understanding. These people have, of course, seen their own share of violence and horror. They regularly go on patrol hunts to keep zombie hordes away from Jackson. Dina herself even reveals that she killed her first non-infected human being at a younger age than Ellie. But trauma and circumstance shapes everyone differently. This sows the seeds of an interesting and thematically central aspect of Ellie's character. Not only is Ellie visibly taking herself out of the scene, but the stage is being set for Ellie to not only alienate the people around her, but large segments of the audience as well. There is a true sense in which this game communicates a message that is not easy to receive if you haven't been through the non-linear loops of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is, however, proved by the fact that people most likely to be receptive to this dimension of trauma core storytelling are politically aligned with dimensions of left-wing social justice as heavily but shallowly influenced by academic queer studies. Much like how humanities students borrow concepts from academic philosophers in lazy and incompetent ways, so too does the rank and file of cultural feminist movements deface these concepts, misapply them, and in the resulting process, poison art with their evil eye. This is not all helped by the fact of the anti-social justice warrior crowd being generally undereducated and unable to grasp these concepts in any meaningful way. Leading us into one primary discourse about the title, pertaining to how Part 2
Gets trauma wrong.
I will be addressing this critique in multiple forms across the entire length of this video, but I will briefly note that this often comes from people who have experienced a particular kind of trauma. That one big trauma which has altered their lives in significant ways. This isn't the trauma that defines Ellie. Even before the events of the first game, Ellie is already a deeply traumatized person. It just only comes out in subtle ways. She has been moving between one life-altering event to another. The psychological dynamics that play out for such a person are totally disanalogous to an internet forum poster, posturing about how they would be even more bitter and vengeful than Ellie. As a self-proclaimed expert, one who has been traumatized in various recurring ways, and indeed, Part 2 helped me realize this fact with crystal clarity, I can invert the queer theoretic conceptual meme and throw down my lens reading of Part 2, and so it shall proceed. It is made clear from the onset that Dina is very close to Ellie, deigning to become far more than that. There is a miniature controversy within Jackson because of a shared kiss between her and Ellie, which sparks a rich and varied set of reactions within the community. As survivors of the old world, there is a predictable amount of homophobia and anti-homophobia, acceptance and non-acceptance. This aspect of the plot is tastefully underplayed and doesn't, as some would have it,
Shove LGBT politics down their throat.
If anything, there is a tendency on all sides to be highly reductive. Dina is, for example, a clearly bisexual character as she can have complicated romantic relationships with first Jesse and now Ellie. This all gets reduced to lesbianism and other unhelpful categories that, even qua the label bisexuality itself, do not communicate the actual phenomenology of romantic experience. So what we have is, at bottom, a tangential romantic plot that serves multiple purposes at once, creating tension at the beginning and end of the story, but sculpting new dents and marks into the characters that populate it. To examine the butterfly effects of a non-heterosexual character is part of the humanistic focus in many zombie apocalypse stories. It is how we react to the Paradise Lost aesthetic that matters, not the world-ending threat itself. We take a non-trivial amount of time exploring these naturalistic relationships before we see the events that pull them apart. The early game prologue cuts to playing as Abby, a muscle-built and intense woman with unclear intentions, builds up anticipation and uncertainty within the story. She is clearly interested in Jackson, and even veers off course of her chosen companions to pursue this goal. It is likely starting to dawn on the player that this all has something to do with Part 1's morally ambivalent ending. After a cinematically interesting sequence, where we run away from a zombie horde that starts off as a few stragglers and turns into a colossal wave, Abby meets up with Tommy and Joel. A considerable amount of moral ambiguity is orchestrated when, for all intents and purposes, Abby finds herself saved by Joel. This so-called monster who decimated the Fireflies is friendly and altruistic. We can see the conflict written on her face as this dissonance hits home. Lulled into a false sense of safety and familiarity, Tommy first identifies Joel when asked, and Joel later confirms it when all but cornered by Abby's crew. 5 years have taken place since the events of Part 1. We no longer behold the same, utterly broken Joel who was given up on humanity and connection. This is a Joel softened by the light of warmth, the glimmer of comfort, and the blanket of trust. This turns out to be a fatal mistake, as we get a deliciously brutal scene in which our starring character from Part 1 is slowly tortured and bludgeoned to death. After smoking weed and napping with Dina, Ellie arrives to the scene just in time to witness the killing blow. As already stated, I expected that this entry would take a few creative risks, and the thought that Joel may even die in the sequel wasn't at all far from my mind. What I didn't anticipate was for it to become the fulcrum upon which the story revolves around itself, spiraling outward from the center, a complicated and intricate narrative that has still impacted me nearly 3 years later. The cinematic direction and motion cap acting adds inexplicable depth and weight to this scene. This title revels in the emotional intensity of its violence. This has resulted in many accusations that Part 2 is quote-unquote
Violence porn.
I simply cannot agree. There are many times where the game tastefully understates its violent scenes because spectacle and gore are not the point. What makes these violent scenes pornographic is 1. The narrative context in which they happen, 2. The fluidly animated and hefty emotional tone imminent to its lacerations. It is violence in its purest form, not as excessive and gross, but something that can be truly beautiful. For certain kinds of traumatized people, myself included, there is a peculiar kind of comfort and familiarity found in violence and cynicism. I often get excited by these scenes, viewing these characters to be majestic angels of death. I take screenshots whenever I encounter them and admire them as their own rightful works of art. These scenes are not made for that audience, however. They share that accidental property because Naughty Dog is competent at conveying interpersonal depth, not because they actively revel in bloody murder. Much criticism has been leveraged against this scene. I've already implicitly addressed the abundant view that Joel would never give himself away in this situation, for we are not dealing with the same shattered and survivalist Joel we met in Part 1. That leaves 2 primary views on this scene. One is that this shouldn't have happened, either because the audience didn't want it, or the pacing was too schizophrenic and we didn't see it happen before coming to actually know Abby. This is an example of letting an 8th grade book report speak for you, indicative of shallow aesthetic autonomy. A story need not cater to audience demands. A plotline is not necessarily enhanced or degraded by your happenstance preferences. The second primary critique is that Abby's crew are irredeemable in some fashion because they are rough with our general cast. It's not just Joel that is hurt, but a brawl ensues. Tommy and Ellie are hurt as well. Ellie is even visibly bleeding. This is a particularly odd critique, for it's naturalistic for split-second decisions to result in excessive violence. Good people do not always have the luxury of calculating the ideal de-escalation when they are running on pure reflex and instinct. Furthermore, it is clearly seen that there is a brief dispute amidst Abby's cast about whether they should go further. This simply means that the attitudes and moral views of our fake-out antagonists are diverse. They are not some monolithic hive mind. There are times when you have to consider if you are not the target audience. Moreover, if you are not even capable of being an audience worth targeting. Now that Part 2 has narrowed our perceptions in rhythm with Ellie, we set off on the classic revenge quest. Tommy is, in a way that will become ironic by the back end of the game, quite wise about it all. He tries to dissuade Ellie from setting off on this suicidal journey, one that is based on a few vague clues. This is, of course, quite unsuccessful, for Ellie is committed to vengeance. Joel and Ellie had taken the first steps to mend their shattered relationship. Now there will never be a final resolution between the two. She not only desires retribution, but a way to participate in the likeness of Joel. Empathetic engagement with what he stood for, as her way of spiritually redeeming him, yelling to the universe that Joel was a lovable person who did what he thought was right. It is too late to communicate any of that to Joel. The world she occupies is now so violent and brutal that she quickly unlearns the fragile and communitarian lessons of Jackson. She is now ready to speak over everyone else. She is joined, very much against her will, by an enthusiastic Dina who wants to stick by her de facto girlfriend. Ellie carries a gnawing secret within her heart. Dina does not yet fully understand why anybody would kill Joel. She vaguely suggests that Joel was a rugged survivor and would have wronged many people. This is left in the air as travelogue, an open question that recalls weighty moral discussions about Joel's actions, echoing throughout the story, reverberating the same questions over and over in ways that coat the entire experience. Arriving in Seattle, we are treated to Naughty Dog's version of a semi-open world format, which recalls a similar experiment they made for the primary map of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. There are quite a few ruinistic buildings to explore for a taste of environmental storytelling. This time around, the puzzles, such as they are a little more intricate. Even scavenging for resources is a calculated move you need to make, for you may end up expending a non-trivial amount of resources simply obtaining them. Naughty Dog has achieved something genuinely valuable here. Rather than keep the player perpetually on rails and locked into a one-way cinematic direction, they have baked in that cinematic direction across the now more open-ended encounter design. You still follow the script, as it were, but now the script has a sense of modality. This is where the moderate but welcome gameplay and visual enhancements make themselves known. Enemy AI is far more intelligent this time around, daring yet subtle. You can never be sure that a building is truly clear of threats. You are the invader here, trespassing on the territory of nature. Neither Ellie nor Dina are welcome here. A message that only resonates further when she uncovers more information about the WLF, wolves, who have posted warning signs everywhere, and yet strangely, the place is deserted of their presence. Ellie largely ignores these details. She is laser focused on her singular objective. The first half of the game sings the same tune. We bought a one-way ticket to hell, with open arms to damnation. We proceed through a routine series of false ends in Ellie's part of the story. Abby is always at some other location, and nobody seems to know where she is. She brutalizes her way through wolves, threatens people with torture in a way inferentially learned from Tommy and Joel, who held belief in the efficacy of enhanced interrogation techniques, and comes across another faction as well, the Seraphites, who we learn very little about, for Ellie herself doesn't care. Part 2 demands that you divorce player agency from character agency. You are not Ellie. You are participating in the kinesthetic dance that eventually brings her story full circle. Her goals are not necessarily your goals. Her decisions are fundamentally unpredictable. Much has been made about how the game is supposed to critique the player or have some reductive murder is bad message, but Part 2 neither has a singular message nor is it interested in creating Spec Ops The Line. This culminates in two important things. Ellie finds out that Dina is in fact pregnant, and that Dina already knew the signs of this. After chastising her for becoming a liability in this situation, they find a lighthouse to camp in and hide out. This is the spark of alienation that will continue all throughout Ellie's journey. Not able or willing to hide it anymore, Ellie reveals the truth about her immunity to the fungal virus. Jesse, always the radiant light in this story that feels too pure for this world, followed our duo and ends up carrying weight while Dina is stuck being de facto immobile and sick with a fetal parasite. Much like the travelogue sections with Dina, small and admirable dashes of characterization are woven into exploration and gameplay itself. Naughty Dog is achieving an interesting syncretic form. where they are now adapting cinema through scattered lessons pulled in from the internet approach to video game storytelling. That is, an approach that uses mechanics and opportunities unique to the game medium itself so as to tell a tale. Utilizing information from Dina, who had gained a lead on Abby by tapping into WLF radio frequencies, a particularly frustrated and desperate Ellie finds one of Abby's friends, Nora, who refuses to give up her location. Nora makes things worse for herself by antagonizing Ellie, saying that Joel is a little bitch who got what he deserved. This leads into a frenetic chase sequence, resulting in them vaulting into an underground superstructure filled with fungal spores. It thus dawns on Nora. Ellie is the girl that Joel slaughtered fireflies to protect, the immune hope for humanity, in both senses of that phrase. And just as I talked about with regard to the prologue, the hammer falls. We receive a narratively paced resemblance of a QuickTime event scene where the player must minimally participate in the brutalization of Nora. Not because the player is being actively judged, it represents that every swing Ellie takes is a conscious choice, one that she makes with extreme hesitance, yet deliberation. She is committing unbridled murder, rather than any kind of self-defensive killing that largely permeates the game. It is noteworthy that, especially when Ellie finds herself alone and absent a companion, she becomes increasingly aggressive, hateful, and brutal in dialogue with her enemies. Many games have tried all sorts of character reactions that obtain in the midst of combat, but none have pulled off the realism and depth that Naughty Dog have delivered here. Enemies have specific names and personality traits who will react in accordance when they happen upon the body of a dead friend or lover. There is a visceral emotion and weight to each and every shot fired. When a human enemy is defeated and dying, they may desperately cling for life, and Ellie's single-minded focus on revenge cuts their vocal cries short as the universe converges upon one path. That is, of course, the aquarium, which we will be revisiting many times throughout this title. Jesse is focused on Dina's health, simply wanting to grab Tommy and head home. Ellie superficially agrees, but drifts from the trio to suicidally pursue Abby anyway. There is a delightful kind of desperation screaming out of Ellie whenever obstacles are in her way, carrying an introverted death drive or an extroverted suicide wish in her heart, diving straight into a rushing river, driving water boats that expose her to fire, and taking on an increasingly militaristic force, the purpose and orientation of which she doesn't even pay close attention to, but some clues are left for the player. Ellie is, in the midst of it all, wrongfully identified as a Scar, as indicated by many WLF members whose lives are cut short by this one-dimensional frenzy. And so we arrive at two controversial sequences that constitute a brain dance in just how they were ever newsworthy to begin with. The first is that Ellie reflexively kills Abby's dog, who attacks her first, casually commenting, "Stupid dog," after it is done. People do not possess much moral agency in split-second moments such as this one. Callously commenting on the entity that just tried to kill you is hardly a deliberated choice. We, of course, later see this dog in the back end of the game when the non-linear structure makes itself known, but this is just communicating the unknown, the metastatic consequences of violence and revenge. It is certainly not some trite, the player should feel bad for this, shadow play. Characters that we will soon come to know and mourn, Owen and Mel, are interrogated by an intense and aggressive Ellie. The duo have their own dissonant dispute about the matter, Mel being tempted to provide the location of Abby, commenting that she is probably dead anyway. This situation spirals out of control, but I should note that it is not the same act of outright murder that characterized her brutalization of Nora. She was, after all, attacked, and responded in appropriate ways for her own safety. It is self-defensive for the most part, yet it is still gruesome, and carries the immense pull of gravity. Ellie knows that Mel, now deceased along with Owen, was pregnant, which is the last straw that communicates to her how far this quest is going. She nearly vomits while her nervous system is visibly raging from within. Interrupting this trauma core scene is Jesse, who has managed to pick up Tommy along the way. It is decided that this revenge quest has gone on long enough. Abby may already be dead for all we know, and Ellie has already caused significant damage to Abby's life anyway. Content to rest at the lighthouse and head back to Jackson, Ellie's would-be quest has come to a halt. That is, until Abby kicks down the door, shoots Jesse and Tommy, with Ellie giving up her gun, explaining that they had nothing to do with this. She's the one Abby wants. Let's rewind. A common critique of this scene is that Tommy is visibly shot in the head, but later in the story seems to have miraculously survived, having minimal access to contemporary hygiene and medicine to boot. This is not, however, what Naughty Dog was going for. On a cinematic level, it certainly looks awkward, but Tommy was shot at an angle such that his eye was damaged with minimal impact to his brain. Plot hole culture, and its addiction to literary naturalism, have constructed the notion that critique and destruction is some default mode of aesthetic analysis, picking things apart even when the product was already whole to begin with. As I've already complained about, I often feel like an 8th grade book report is speaking to me when I engage with these aesthetic standards. They leave no room for impression, sentiment, and higher order thematic content to guide their senses as the artistic dance achieves its frenzy
and catharsis.
Instead, everything is supposed to fit into naturalistic cause and effect, a resonance with metaphysical naturalism and the accepted scientific worldview. This way of approaching art is highly reductive and disputable. It is neither the historically dominant trend, nor does the mere dominance of an aesthetic trend justify its existence. And so we cut to Seattle Day 1 again, this time from Abby's point of view. The experiment with pacing here is absolutely brilliant. We have a significant amount of game left, and we shan't see the resolution to the lighthouse scene for quite a while. I remember desperately playing through these segments with my personal illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, possibly long COVID in disguise, which punished me for exerting myself so much. On subsequent playthroughs, and otherwise in retrospect, I can appreciate that the narrative wants us to engage with the one-dimensional perspective of Ellie first, until our sight is purified completely. Through the eyes of Abby, we see that the WLF is a complex and relatively self-sustaining society. They are militaristic and brutal beyond all that, but the inner core of their lives seems normal enough. When we were playing as Ellie, the player was able to uncover clues about what emerged this power structure. One note is particularly interesting. The WLF rebelled against the previous quarantine zone in Seattle. The prison is governmental spaces in which we began the primary adventure in Part 1. However, it is revealed that Fedra, the previous occupying power, were not absent moral ambiguities. One dying commander grimly noted that it will be ironic when the wolves have to contend with, as a vague description, those religious fanatics. In the present tense, we can see that the WLF have become comparable to the government. Whether they are worse or better than the power they overturned is very hard to say. It is not even the point. This is made ominously clear when Isaac, the Promethean and morally grey leader of the wolves, decides that there have been too many cycles of false peace between them and the religious Seraphites. It is time to end their conflict, once and for all. Abby does, however, note that Owen is missing, upon which it is revealed that he is estranged from the wolves because he was last seen killing a fellow WLF member to protect some Seraphite. Not believing this story in its entirety, and taking her loyalty to friendship to be above political authority, Abby straight up abandons the WLF. Our soon-to-be brutalized Nora helps her sneak out of the ensuing march. Abby's journey begins in a way comparable to that of Ellie. Her focus is narrow, her interpretations of the world are equally shallow. Yet it is upon encountering Lev and Yara, Seraphite escapees who are being hunted by their religious kin, that not only must Abby confront the human face of her enemy, but grow to understand her moral place in the world. She is not absent self-doubt regarding the brutal murder of Joel. Her ex-boyfriend, Owen, turns out to be shaken by it as well. Mel is simply disgusted at her, avoiding her, and all but refusing to speak with her. Abby nearly leaves these teenage Seraphite heretics to fend for themselves, but eventually come back around where it is clear that Yara is severely injured and cannot move on her own. She takes the distraction upon herself to help these adolescents. Here is where Abby discovers a better side of herself, one that she begins to cling on to. A face she can look into the mirror with full acceptance. This is not, as some people have read it, entirely focused on her brutality with Joel. Mel certainly considers that to be the last straw, but Abby has grown into militaristic violence. Even more so than Ellie, it is half of what she knows. The other half is the community and supply chains that her violence keeps protected from warring factions. We're not meant to like Abby more than Ellie. The crystallization of Abby does not come at the cost of Ellie. We are meant to understand these characters and the circumstances that made them who they are today and who they want to become. Abby's back end of the game is lighter in tone, filled with spectacle and adventurism. We enjoy a greater weapon selection in resonance with the bombastic zombie encounter design. It is the action-adventure experience people expected to constitute the whole of Part 2. But this doesn't stand as a byproduct of production scoping. I hold it to be quite intentional. Ellie's world has narrowed to a singular goal, so too does the game world in lockstep with her, now standing in stark contrast to Abby's developing story. Thus begins our frenetic journey with Lev. The game has been giving us small clues about the Scars or Seraphites the entire time, but here, depending on how you interpret it, Lev lays down either the orthodox or heterodox interpretation. Like many sympathetic interpretations of organized religiosity, Part 2 suggests that the Seraphite origin could have been noble. That's what Lev believes anyway, noting that the earliest texts say nothing about violence in Crusade. The game leaves the lore dimension of this question open-ended, but it is indicative of an excessive religious tolerance implicit in the script. When we were playing as Ellie, she encountered a synagogue and explored it with Dina, providing Dina ample opportunity to opine on her religious upbringing. You can even find a copy of the Torah in the midst of this, yet not many words of explicit critique are evident in either case. The Seraphites are, to be sure, fanatical and violent, but that is presented as religiosity distorted, not its beating heart. As an atheo-pagan and atheo-platonist myself, in sum, ultimacy is not incompatible with atheism, I am not unsympathetic to defenses of minimalist religion. It is, however, a matter of historical and present-day precedent that prophets, cult leaders, and sacred texts are ignoble in their origins. Part 2 has a pluralistic series of narratives speaking to the player at once, and it doesn't hammer home anything definitive about religion. But it should be noted that hipster interpretation of a tradition doesn't sanctify that tradition. It is instead a person's independent moral thought, shrouded in the language of established religion. While Abby finds something like salvation by way of helping these estranged adolescents, her WLF friends are naturally uneasy about it. We get a brutal scene where Mel simply tells Abby that she is not a good person, implying that she shouldn't pretend otherwise. Nonetheless, Yara's fractures are severe enough so as to infect her bloodstream, and she will die without an already risky surgery in a fundamentally unhygienic environment. Such is the catalyst of our frenetic quest, humanizing Lev and Abby by way of Uncharted-style spectacle. The journey to Lake Hill Seattle Hospital is thrilling and revelatory. Lev is not without benefits from following his religion. There's a scene where Abby reveals her terror upon ascending great heights in elevators, to which her newfound companion comments to focus on the good aspects to fear. It makes your body stronger, your reflexes sharper. Hidden within your fear is the power to overcome obstacles set in your way. This lesson settles into abstraction, hanging in the air as it were, made particularly ironic by the fact that Lev gently guides Abby over an overhanging sky bridge, only for it to collapse on them in an unmarked, multi-residential unit infested with zombies. But there is a genuine sense in which this impression sticks. Just as Ellie and Joel learn from each other in an initially tense but ultimately constructive relationship in Part 1, we see a similar dynamic play out between this duo instead. While Ellie is steadily losing pieces of herself in response to a harsh and brutal world, in parallel with Joel's dark past, Abby is discovering lessons that Joel uncovered later in life and ultimately died in his expression. I have noted that it is the love and warmth of Jackson that ultimately led to Joel's death. His newfound willingness to trust and let his guard down backfired at the wrong moment. There is a felt tension between survival and living, one that threads both games together. You can survive quite well shooting everyone first and hiding under a rock, but is that a life worth living? Should you prolong years of misery for its own sake, or is it worth risking everything, just for mere moments of serenity? The game seems to grasp onto the latter proposition. Quality of life is more important than nominal life itself. Revealed in Frenzied Travelogue and Exploration is the fact that Lev is transgender, female to male in this case. Quite an interesting choice given the informational dominance of male to female perspectives. Just as we freshly explored the adrenaline-fueled aspect of the game, standing in stark contrast to Ellie's narrow revenge quest, we are given space to move around in the soul sphere shared between Lev and Abby. Abby gently pokes Lev about his identity a few times, but is content to let the question slide as communicative, implicit understanding. The Seraphites, on the other hand, do not see this implied social role reversal as compatible with their religious practice. We hear Scars misgendering Lev in the midst of gameplay, a fact that Lev picks up on, uncomfortably bringing it up to Abby, testing the waters as it were, to see if she noticed at all. Abby makes it clear that this is not an issue she is going to pry about.
You would think.
That this should be tasteful transgender representation, even the height of it. Lev is, after all, an interesting character who naturally belongs to the world.
His representation is not reductive or shallow.
His LGBT identity is woven into the storyline and the surrounding lore in creative ways. A diversity of perspectives between acceptance and non-acceptance are lampshaded in ways immersive to the flow of gameplay itself, while acting as imminent critique of bigoted perspectives.
Well, you'd be dead fucking wrong. Fucking wrong.
The culture war is insane, polluted by cognitively unimpressive people who substitute reading the room for ethics, taking insight to be about picking up opinions sanctified by one's peers. I can't believe the discourse surrounding this issue, from poorly written Kotaku articles to the otherwise impressive Noah Caldwell's video essay breaking down a few times on the subject.
As a side note, Lev is still wearing his own clothes. There's never any attempt by the plot to sexualize the violence done to him or diminish his gender identity, even in this moment, where the developers certainly had an opportunity to be crassly graphic.
Not to mention the masochistic self-flagellation in the comments section of his video, and anti-social justice warriors being their usually clueless selves about the matter. There is almost too much that must be unpacked here. One criticism is that there should have been a content warning system integrated into the Seraphite misgendering scenes. This is taken by many socially progressive people as simply fair. We never receive an explanation for why this demand is fair, it is only stated. So afraid to be crowded out of their socially self-regulating spaces, they rarely go against the grain of their own movement. This encourages scholasticism and insularity. Pure aesthetic concerns go underrated here. It could be detrimental to the beauty and flow of a scene to introduce content warnings, and it may be against one's artistic vision to include an optional toggle for content warnings. This is frequently thrown to the wayside as irrelevant. Psychological concerns about the possible health states of hypothetical people is overridingly what matters here. Why? We never receive an answer, only a scandalized glare or some histrionic fit.
Social justice warriors,
A phrase that is not exclusively used by conservatives, by the way,
And you would know this if you're not a victim of
out-group hegemony,
are rarely prepared for genuine moral and aesthetic debate. They often have background going but philosophically controversial theories that forever preclude legitimate dispute here. It is anti-intellectual and authoritarian to the core, reserving semiotic space for an oversized yet undefined ideological machine. But I am no stranger to the dangers of PTSD triggers and dramatically unrolling progress in recovering one's psychoneurophysiological health. As I've noted in the introductory phases to this essay, I have all the identity political credentials in the world, so let me tell you a little story about myself. From the age of 5, I had trouble with the school system.
What was it?
I simply did not want to attend the school. I wasn't bullied, abused, or treated badly in the interpersonal sense. I viewed school to be a prison from which I was not allowed to escape. I was content to only show up for tests. I am a millennial who adopted the internet at age 4 and never had to attend lectures to ace any test.
But the government
Certainly had their own problem with this. Upon the threat of my parents being imprisoned for my passive defiance of school, I was put through the psychiatric system and misdiagnosed with a series of false labels that failed to take my perspective
seriously.
I objected to authority and mandates for philosophical reasons, not one's explicable in purely psychological terms. The game of messing around with outpatient programs continued for a while until it became inevitable that I was to go into a 6-month inpatient program. This was filled with people who had overt behavioral and moral issues. But I was never violent. I was the passive and well-spoken, conscientious objector, which means I got out of that group home quickly and, as such, continued to rebel against school until I reached an age where the state could no longer legally threaten my parents and otherwise my stable living situation for resisting their insanity. The constant stress and chronic sleep deprivation I experienced over this left me deeply traumatized, however, and I quickly devolved into polysubstance abuse in reaction to how much this experience damaged me. This continued until my mid-20s, culminating in a suicide attempt with a high dose of fentanyl and benzodiazepines that I miraculously survived. To this day, I still deal with resolving my complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So how does this relate to content warnings? The Witcher 3 once triggered me into a 36-hour panic attack because of a prominent heartbeat sound that plays in one of the pinnacle boss fights found in the Blood and Wine expansion. Did I blame the developers and artists for this? No. I understood that triggers are hyper-individualized, unpredictable, and the world is too full of rich and varied stimuli for me to reasonably demand that people cater to my misfortunes. These are the lenses by which I read content warnings. I understand how horrible these experiences are, but even within that understanding, I do not agree that content warnings are morally obligatory. If social justice movements were even halfway serious, they could intake this viewpoint as grounds for relatively cool-headed dispute, instead of throwing temper tantrums and revealing that they need to take an Ethics 101 class before they speak about anything ever. Another criticism on offer is that Lev is framed in such a way to appeal to cisgendered people. Why? Because Lev is portrayed in a light that doesn't make a cis person uncomfortable. A kind of benevolent exclusion, or inclusion if you will. It is through the sympathetic portrayal of Lev that we reduce Lev in non-progressive ways. I simply hold this viewpoint to be absurd. There are absolutely no parameters under this vaguely defined standard in which representation could count as generally good representation.
What's happening here is that one voice,
one among many, was for some reason or another uncomfortable with this portrayal of Lev. Rather than utilize introspection and an extended process of autonomous thought to truly process these feelings, they posted a poorly written article on Kotaku, vaguely suggesting that a better world is possible where Lev would be portrayed in ways that do not make them by happenstance uncomfortable. This is what Nietzsche terms the religion of comfortableness, the self-lacerating edge of a weapon that morphs pity into a dark means of authoritarian constraint on people that fails to actually help them. It only spreads misery and malcontent. Drifting to another side of the visible divide, we have a collage of people who don't want any of this represented whatsoever. There are two primary dimensions to this. It's saying that they simply don't want political commentary shoved down their throat. They want to enjoy the narrative qua narrative. There are multiple meanings inherent within this. A common use case for the word political is one that is electoral and provocative. An issue that sounds like it will eventually be talked about by some politician in a representative democratic system. This is where the contrasting crowd, who dogmatically insist that all or most art is in some sense
Political.
misunderstand their opponents. in expressing extremely basic and youthful insights that artistic products can have political content embedded into them, despite the intentions of the author and audience reception, they are effectively speaking past everyone else. Yet that doesn't make their claim any less legitimate. I manifestly agree that art has political content, whether we like it or not. It is nonetheless important to understand what another speaker means when they complain about those damn SJWs shoving all this in our faces. After all, this crowd of people is not uniform. Many of them understand that even heteronormative and monomyth stories are, in some sense, political, or at least could become political. They may even oppose that as well in some sense. It is important to reserve collective judgments for small and consistent collectivities, not nearly incalculable swaths of people. Otherwise, it is deeply non-obvious what could please these people, no matter how we slice it. It doesn't seem possible to depoliticize stories like The Last of Us without the artist taking a hatchet to their own product and dampening its thematic weight. We must consider that politicized art is not necessarily valuable because of its political content, but because political content comes out as a side effect of more fundamental storytelling virtues. As such, I throw this anti-social justice critique to the wayside along with all the others. One could talk forever about the philosophical and cultural nuances within these discourses, but it should suffice to say that people should reevaluate their concepts before screaming them at other people. Often your opponent may already be manifestly familiar with their worldview. Often you may have misunderstood your own influences. Often your modulation of these concepts may be the products of social reinforcement, rather than held in a continuous process of reflective judgment. This is where I have a problem with casually spoken lens readings of a text. A lens reading is one that frames a textual work within a given perspective. A perspective not necessarily intended by some author, but one that can be extracted from the text nonetheless. While it is an interesting and perhaps useful concept, it is common for leftists to take the fact that conservatives misunderstand what lens readings are as a justification for the concept itself. For it is quite possible to, in the midst of intellectual fashion trends like a queer lens reading, to be so narrowly focused that you have mistargeted the work entirely, diminishing its scope and value, rather than simply adding dimension by the brute act of considering it in another light. In quite an arrogant and thus ironical way, I would here caution humility. Alright, that was a fun deviation. Let's get back into the thick of it. After a restricted quality space encounter with a zombie metamorph that acts as an interesting spray and gather boss fight, we barely obtained enough resources to save Yara's life while learning unfortunate clues about what led to the demise of this hospital. It seems that this was actually ground zero for the fungal infection, and the political disputes involved therein are brutal but typical for humanistic zombie media. The aforementioned boss fight, entitled The Rat King, is actually the result of patients turned zombies. Unwitting and terrified patients who were locked down into a lower level ward and thus over time merged together. It helps hammer home that our protagonists occupy a doomed and fallen world, yet, at the same time, communities like Jackson, even too the wholesome sides of the WOF, are proof that humanity can not only survive, but thrive against the pandemic. It is not set in stone that the embers of humanity will be snuffed out by the zombie horde. We do, after all, have the ability to form complicated societies and logistical plans to stave off these threats. Precisely because our industrial information era societies had many critical points of failure at once, was the zombie threat able to tear everything apart. It was a fragile system to begin with, whereas this new humanity are routing around the damage, as it were, scattered but not broken. As long as a single territory stands, humanity remains legion. This incidentally is why common critiques that Part 2 makes no space for community building, as if that message itself were not one-dimensional and reductive, are profoundly confusing. Do we not see humanity lighting campfires in the darkness? Does the grit oozing from the story taint your perspective so as to become blind to the presentation entirely? Mel performs the surgery and it seems that everything will be fine. When Yara is mobile, she has a chance to communicate Lev's backstory to Abby, adding further depth to what their estrangement actually means. Yara stood by her brother, even as it cost her everything, even though Lev's defiance obtained severe consequences, including potential exile or death for their entire family. It was revealed that their mother especially did not take kindly to Lev's defiance of Seraphite traditionalism. It is a touching scene that adds further marks and scratches to this multifaceted story, and set the stage for Abby's own Day 3 in Seattle. As usual, much misguided critique has been leveraged at this scene. I will not go on at length about it, but I will note one thing. Revealing information about your friends to other friends is not necessarily a privacy-violating, unethical norm. This is not made automatically true simply because you think talking about gender identity and history behind someone's back is on some level iffy. You are free to make a moral argument for your position, but random screeching is not a moral argument. It is, in fact, indicative of deficient moral thought. So consider silence if you have not put any meaningful thought into your ethical system whatsoever. This moment has been visibly building up amidst the sea of dissolved tension. As lightly foreshadowed, Lev has gone off to the Seraphite Island, desperate to make peace with or save his mother. Abby's neck deep into the lives of these teenagers by this point, finding it quite natural to simply chase after him and Yara. Yet there is a tremendous complication amidst this. Isaac had already placed Abby in lockdown, and Nora helped her escape earlier. The WLF are planning an attack on the Seraphite village to blow this peace craze over. By nature itself, if this does not constitute some of the best sequences in the gameplay and general plot, we have a tense scene where our quest for passage is interrupted by, wouldn't you know it, Tommy firing rounds with deadly precision. We get a lengthy and existentially dissonant sequence where the dedicated interloper is our friendly face and referential constant, shining in demonic glory as his survivalist self. It is quite an extensive process to crawl towards him and distract him, ending in a non-linear and looping type of chase sequence where zombie hordes are used against us as he flees. This results in a brilliant frenzy and flourish, and the last we see of Tommy, at least from Abby's point of view, is him falling deep into the water, pacified, but still deadly in the semiotic aura he already left behind. By this point, the WF vaguely know that a mysterious group of trespassers have been devastating their operations, only adding more complexity and brutality toward the already body-piling conflict with the Scars. The Seraphite Island at war is truly a visual feast to behold. You can feel that this is the territory of war, a human-orchestrated atmosphere of chaos and violence that can set blazes far more dramatic and impactful than even the most disgusting fungal zombie infection. It is a semi-open set piece of discursive game events, having to hunt, scavenge, and survive as the Seraphites use an intelligent system of whispers and signals to coordinate each other's position. This is baked into the actual AI system in intelligent ways, and it is this tricky system of group coordination that makes Part 2 feel something more than just your generic third-person action-adventure shooter, mixing together your usual stealth and gunplay mechanics. Catching up to Lev, we see him visibly shaking, absolutely broken from what he just went through. That's not, of course, the war. He's already used to that kind of horror. No, his mother was so enraged with the religious frenzy that she would hear nothing from Lev, not even the hint of an explanation. She immediately resorted to violence, and Lev, in self-defense, ended up killing his mother. He risked hell and more just to have an opportunity to talk to her, or at least save her from punishment, and all she knew was traditional doctrine. Yara consoles Lev, and we leave home behind, for good. We don't just have the Scars to contend with, however, for this is a battlefield in its purest sense. We are taking out WF and Seraphite soldiers left and right, trying to escape hell on earth and leave this factional clash of bloodlust and murder behind us. That's not quite possible, at least not yet. Amidst this failed assault is Isaac on the death march, desperate to make this zero-sum invasion play out towards some positive end, and it is here that Isaac meets Abby in a new light. Much like how Owen was suspected to have defected from the WLF to protect, of all people, a Seraphite, here Abby is, defector, deserter, and traitor, with 2 Scar allies behind her. What is he to make of all this? Nothing per se. His single-mindedness shaped by conflict and brutality goes immediately for the kill, or rather, a loyalty test. If Abby does not step away from Lev, he will kill both her and Lev. Now it is time to prove which side she is on. It is Yara who, having already been shot by the WLF troops and presumed passive, exhales her last breath and takes life away in the same gust of wind. Isaac is fallen, and Abby's decision is reinforced. A frozen Lev is spirited away by Abby as we try to scrape together sanity out of all this madness. As I've implied, this story is relatively non-linear and schizophrenic. It doesn't sit right with some players that we have an entire game-defining detour to save Yara, only for her to be snuffed away from us a few gameplay hours later. But the destination is not the journey. Saving Yara was an introspective journey for Abby, a characterization reel for Lev, and a lore-building adventure for the player. There's nothing wrong with dabbling in a little cynical realism from time to time. To have our greatest efforts to save someone's life miserably fail. For the universe to mock our best efforts and its indifferent cruelty. Part 2 paints deep tones of black, yes, but not for its own sake. A truly grimdark approach would appeal to traumatized people like me, but much like the first game, a silhouette can be seen in the darkness. It has a pluralistic series of messages and themes, like a downward sliding gamma ratio, painting motifs that can be brought squirming into the light or repressed back into the most desolate cave. Now it is time for these disparate threads to loop back onto themselves. Throughout the game, we had an extensive series of wholesome flashback sequences, which add further context to Abby's plot and Ellie's emotional turmoil. From seeing the peak of Ellie and Joel's relationship, to dwindling into nothing at all after Ellie finally makes the road trip back to the old Firefly base to confirm what she already suspected. Abby herself dreams of a time when the aquarium, the interesting geographical focal point of the game, was decorated by Owen, without even a dark tonal catch to it all, at least in the past tense. For we see what even singular human hands can craft in this desolate world, and how tragic it is when it is all snuffed out. As witnessed, Owen later dies adjacent to his own work of art, and, to thematically wrap it all together, it was partially one elaborate gift to Mel, who also perished upon its periphery. Not only have we encountered Abby at her spiritual apex when finding salvation through Lev and Yara, but even in her rough and gruff heydays, there was humanity and gentleness to her. Abby would soon come to realize the gravity of losing that which is precious. Echoes of the past mark the graves that direct Abby's retroactive journey away from war and back into the phenomenological void, the absence of her friends. Nora was brutalized. Owen and a very much pregnant Mel is dead as well. From her perspective, one comes to wonder just who would do this and why, yet in the back of her mind, an answer is already emerging. And so we arrive back at the lighthouse. Lev is already cautioning Abby against this path, but his safety and sense of purpose is too interwoven with her own path to just abandon her here. And the brawl begins. We see Jesse and Tommy get shot again as these two stories collide, resulting in a brilliant chase sequence as Ellie corners Abby into a dimly lit room, wielding and firing a deadly shotgun. It is a tremendous feeling to play as Abby during this moment. Ellie is a genuinely terrifying force of nature, capable of malice and extreme hate. On the higher difficulty settings, the sneak and survive gameplay rhythm impresses an inescapable fact onto you. Ellie is not somebody who fucks around. This is when the Dionysian frenzy transcends the divine. We the audience act as a kind of passive chorus. We feast upon Ellie and Abby destroying each other, playing out mutual reinforcing cycles of revenge until eventually, Abby, perhaps quite unexpectedly, gains the upper hand. Dina ineffectively but desperately interferes. The entire scene is grim and brutal, a complete isomorphism of violence and rage in purest form. Having overpowered Dina, Abby moves to slit her throat. Ellie desperately informing Abby that Dina is pregnant. Having already witnessed the scene where Mel, a very much pregnant woman, was killed by Ellie in circumstances she may have falsely assumed was only murderous, simply replies, "Good." It is Lev, forming the moral compass and the pathway of redemption for Abby, who interferes at this critical moment, reminding Abby that there is another way, that Ellie is simply walking in her shoes. She can take the high road, it can end here, and so, it seems, it does. We are treated to an interesting fake-out ending, one that almost worried me. Dina and Ellie are living a life they've talked about before, quiet and on the farm, raising Jesse's baby and letting days pass by in serenity. Yet all is not quite right. Much like how Ellie was rarely able to feel present in Jackson, this farm life is a kind of illusory lie. The trauma of her life recurrently causes flashbacks and panic attacks. The imagery of Joel, bloody and battered, particularly impresses on her. She even has one of these triggering moments in the midst of taking care of Dina's baby, the sudden stress of which would be healthy for nobody involved. It is clear she has trouble adjusting, as if she were saying to the earth, "I don't belong here, not in this atmosphere." This boiling tension reaches a climax, for a suspicious vehicle is parked outside of the farm and Dina is audibly conversing with somebody. A paradigm shift awaits. Tommy is missing an eye, a rather overt representation of the eye for an eye vengeance motif, and has found a lead on Abby. Just as Ellie found only a vague and unreliable clue for Tommy to follow in the early game, so too does this loop repeat itself. Tommy has lost everything, his health, his marriage. All he has is bitterness, loss, and a renewed taste for revenge. He is consumed with hate. Always coming off as some understanding glow of light in the games thus far, we disturbingly see his darkest shade made manifest. Frustrated with Ellie repeating familiar talking points back to him, once that he spoke in the prologue himself, he goes straight to antagonism, calling Ellie a coward. I cannot stress enough how much this is an immensely powerful yet misunderstood sequence of events. All of this sinks into Ellie's head, and classically she plans to slip out of the house at midnight. Unable to let go, her nervous system is still burning from within. She needs to resolve this one way or another. Dina confronts her and makes it clear that this is an ultimatum, a breaking point. If Ellie leaves, Dina won't be here when she comes back, if she even comes back. Ellie accepts this. As I've mentioned, Part 2 acts as a fantastic character study into how a person can alienate themselves and the people around them, and thereby a significant part of an unsympathetic audience. Many people do not fundamentally understand why Ellie would give up everything after already apparently abandoning her hunt for Abby. It is simply the fact that progress, and trauma itself, is a non-linear horoscope, a series of vignettes into your nervous system, always screaming and finding ways to pull you back into the abyss. There is a close relationship between schizophrenia and stress in general, and is born in the fact that it can make your motivations and life events loop around themselves in truly odd ways. Rather than getting trauma wrong, as some would have it, The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the rare media material that even halfway understands it. We touch base with Abby and Lev. Their journey has a thin atmosphere of hope, optimism, and lightheartedness about it. They found freedom from political bondage, war, and share strength between each other. It is quite easy to believe that, having arrived in the rumored Santa Barbara, which contains ostensibly regrouped fireflies, that Abby is legitimately going to meet them. Hindsight tells us that they are walking into an obvious trap, but the tonal shading imminent to the scene makes it easy to be deceived. Our adventurism thus ends, and Abby is headed for the deepest depths of despair. Almost tracing her shadow in a 6-month temporal radius, we cut back to Ellie, who is focused, roughly worn, and survivalistic in her presentation. Getting anywhere at all was shown in the first game to be a major hurdle. It's why smuggling Ellie to the Fireflies took an entire game to complete. This has been a point of redundant critique. Characters are casually making long journeys skipped over as scene transitions, but I've never found this to be a convincing problem. We can imagine many scenarios of crisis and near-death experiences that Ellie incurred on her way to California, but they're not necessary to show. Furthermore, Ellie is an expert survivalist, and even in naturalistic media like The Last of Us, it is not uncommon for our protagonists to become exceptionally skilled people, able to survive almost anything, or overcome as just another day in the proverbial office. Ellie examines the tracks of her prey, stalking like the shadow of death. There is a felt unease when playing as this murderous Ellie, one who is far removed from the sympathies of all but a small audience. She is genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. You may not necessarily feel comfortable playing as her right now. She, like Abby, falls into a rattler trap, slavers who have created the fake Firefly rumor and telecom signal, but worms her way out of it through pure desperation and desolation. She has nothing to lose, and already looks on the verge of death from her journey. Even in this dialogue, we get a glimpse into who the rattlers are, not just a monolithic group of one-dimensional slavers, but a raging frenzy of conflicting interests who have grown accustomed to the plantation around them. The shifts between the slavers and enslaved are, as revealed in notes scattered throughout the area, always in flux. The residency itself is unstable. This is why, upon laziness borne by one rattler complaining that Ellie doesn't seem worth the effort to capture, she goads her two would-be kidnappers into taking a trip to hell. Unaware that Ellie is immune to the fungal infection, one slaver unsuccessfully tries to force her hand into an entrapped zombie, a terrifying prospect for anyone else. Having disarmed and killed the interloper, she quickly fires on his buddy, who pleads for his life. Relaxing just long enough to extract information about a person who is certainly Abby, there's not even a real pause, hesitation, or a look of remorse as she lets the bullet fly. The admittedly unsympathetic slaver is added to her impressive death toll. And so we engage in a little taste of accidental heroics. Not pure heroics, of course. Ellie is also concerned with finding information about the precise location of Abby. Upon decimating the resort and freeing its captured prisoners, while almost herself being shot for her noble deed, she learns that Abby is being held in a crucifixion area. Those who have expended their usefulness or proven too stubborn to domesticate reside there. The Rattlers are an interesting faction for the fact that they are redundant. I would have found it quite poetic if Abby had truly met regrouped Fireflies, and that the last gameplay segments involved Ellie slaughtering her way through Fireflies to reach Abby, in rhythm and lockstep with Joel, finishing her outlet of rage, her murderous forgiveness of Joel. Over time, however, I have come to understand the Rattlers and their value. It's not unlikely that a bunch of malicious good-for-nothings would orchestrate such a rumor and a trap. Moreover, they provide a setting in which the tension between Abby and Ellie feels, in the large scale of things, pointless. That is their function, to add contrast and dysfunction to a problem that only makes sense when your perspective of the world has been completely distorted into one emotional tone, that of revenge. We now encapsulate and animate this expanding concentric circle of this schizotypical journey. Ellie is caked in blood and hardly in any shape to walk, but as we have seen in the farm, she has trouble letting go. There has to be a final confrontation, and to her mind, at this point, it should be a deadly one. Abby is so weakened from dehydration and starvation that she has lost a significant amount of muscle mass, looking as though she has aged 20 years. It doesn't necessarily occur to Abby that Ellie is still out for revenge at this point. They are in such a traumatic and violent context that it wouldn't make perfect sense to fight each other after escaping literal slavery. This occurs to Ellie as well, and the cinematography of this extended moment is simply perfect. We have a fairly lengthy walking scene arriving at two boats ready to go, as if they could quietly part ways in mutual understanding. This almost happens, but as the game reminds us, Ellie simply cannot let go. At least, her nervous system won't allow that yet. She has sacrificed everything, and Abby's mere presence reminds her of the entire catalyst of Part 2's events, of Joel. So much that she forces the fight, threatening to slice open Lev if Abby does not entertain her extroverted death wish. From this, we are treated to a controversial but brutal fight scene. For many people, this clash feels off-tone, as if there should be a gameplay-heavy brawl in a cinematic and narratively focused moment like this one. But I heavily disagree. The fight itself blurs the lines between gameplay and film. One must be actively trying to get hurt to even reach a fail state. It is, in a way, resonant with the quick-time events of the original God of War trilogy, which were incredible visual feats of storytelling woven into an interactive process, functioning as a way to extend the emotional overtones steaming from each frame. After all, Abby doesn't even have a weapon. Ellie has a sharp knife. This is not a fight per se. It is Ellie merely intending to slaughter Abby. On the cusp of victory, and forcibly drowning Abby in the sea, everything comes to a head as yet another flashback hits Ellie, as she learns to, in some fashion, truly let go. Quite literally letting go of Abby in this case, breaking out into traumatic shaking, tears streaming down her face, as she quietly tells Abby to just go and take Lev. The resulting scene of Abby sitting on the shoreline, shaking to herself and reflecting on all that she has lost, is extremely memorable and breathtaking. It is this precise frame that made me confront my own complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Part 2 has delivered unto us the profoundest depth of emptiness. If Ellie's murderous rampage was an extroverted and misguided way to redeem Joel by participating in his dark past, then the final flashback, one that we see unfold in his actual form after the shoreline fight, was an imprint into her nervous system, truly understanding that Joel wouldn't want her to go this far, that everything Joel did revolved upon the premise of Ellie living a meaningful life, that Ellie never wanted to become this dark avatar of death. If Ellie wanted her death to matter, Joel wanted her life to matter. And just as she watched Abby senselessly murder Joel for misguided reasons, that would have been Lev's perspective repeated, which is why Ellie briefly mentions Lev as implied, further fact motivation for resigning the fight. The reasons behind why Ellie ends up sparing Abby are multifaceted and complicated. If you are following this story through a detached series of sterile abstractions, assuming characters to have constant access to perfect information about themselves and the world, then you will not understand the trauma-driven actions of Ellie. Her behavior is non-linear and non-continuous. She represents what it truly means to be a broken person. When your trauma controls you more than you control yourself, then you know that you are in the thick of it and need to take more than several steps back. Sparing Abby is Ellie's first step toward internal peace. It just took so much re-traumatizing loss, rage, and collateral damage along the way. Such is the nature of the world. Such is the nature of our relatively unpredictable and messy selves. The Last of Us Part 2 understands emotion and irrational maneuvers on a deep sense, but does the audience? Part 2 asks a lot from the player. They must explore several landscapes of opposing motivations and modality at once. Furthermore, they have to simultaneously project themselves into and take themselves out of characters when it is appropriate, never putting too much or too little of themselves into the game. One must have some thin understanding of traumatic stress and behavioral loops. If you, like me, have experienced thought loops through psychedelics, have been through bouts of psychosis, have PTSD, have become and met so many tonal varieties of people, then the narrative stream resonates with your soul instantly. If not, then you are not necessarily the target audience. Much like the subtitle for Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book for all and none, the same can be said of The Last of Us Part 2. It is the story for everybody and nobody at once. Abstract and cognitive empathy in all of their multi-dimensional varieties are demanded from the player. This is why defenders of Part 2 can come off as smug, superior, and elitist. It simply feels like that the other side is lacking something, either in cognitive ability or experiential familiarity. Yet, a world of global interdependence and high population density is making difference itself the norm. Perhaps, with time, stories like Part 2 will become truly universal, as we progress ever more into a homogenized yet pluralized society of distinction and axiological dissent. we have journeyed through the hell of culture war disputes, pop sociological concepts, and an unjustifiably controversial video game. I would say it'd be like The Godfather Part 2 receiving a mixed reception, but that actually happened. And so I would like to take a moment to thank the people who have supported me thus far. And remember, if I pronounce something wrong, no I didn't. That's just called a dialect. So in regard to Sereneste, Eppinger, Gustav Xiao, Ephribu, Palomar, and Fall from Space, as well as everyone else who has helped me survive the last 2 years without becoming homeless, and you know who you are. I'm excited to create more video essays,
basically schizophrenic skits.
Perhaps I should make actual use of my 7-string guitar instead of sampling everything. And as a taste of foreshadowing, know that my next major project has a character named Lord Foreshadow in the first game.
Now isn't that murder? Now isn't that murder?